August 29th, 1949. A Tuesday morning that history wasn't supposed to write for another decade. Deep within the desolate steppes of Semipalatinsk, Kazakhstan, the earth suddenly shudders. A flash of light, brighter than 1,000 suns, tears through the atmosphere, followed by a roar that echoes across the Iron Curtain. High above, a massive, terrifying mushroom cloud begins to bloom, the signature of the atom. For the American public, the news arrives like a physical blow. We were told the Soviet Union was a primitive power, a nation of peasants and broken factories, exhausted by the war. Our intelligence experts at the CIA had predicted they wouldn't possess a nuclear weapon until the mid-1950s at the earliest. Yet, here it was. The Soviets called it RDS-1. We called it Joe-1, after Joseph Stalin. But as the radiation settled, a much darker realization began to dawn on Washington and London. This wasn't just a Russian scientific breakthrough. When the first analysis of the fallout reached the Pentagon, the data told a chilling story. The Soviet bomb was a near-perfect replica of the Fat Man device we had dropped on Nagasaki. Every technical specification, every complex calculation, every secret of the most guarded project in human history had been bypassed. How did a nation in ruins jump ahead 5 years in a single morning? The answer wasn't found in a Russian laboratory, but in the heart of our own. Somewhere within the razor-wire fences of Los Alamos, a ghost had been at work. Not a professional thief or a military general, but a quiet, brilliant, and utterly unassuming physicist. His name was Klaus Fuchs. To his colleagues, he was the model of dedication. To the Soviet Union, he was the man who had quite literally given them the sun. But to understand how this frail-looking academic pulled off the greatest heist in the history of warfare, we have to look past the mushroom clouds and into a mind that was as split as the atom itself. How did we let him in? And more importantly, why did he do it? The story of Klaus Fuchs isn't just about physics. It's about the ultimate betrayal of trust. Imagine the most secure facility on the planet. Deep in the high desert of New Mexico, a city that officially didn't exist was built on a mesa called Los Alamos. This was the Pangea of the Manhattan Project. It was a pressure cooker of genius, housing the greatest minds of the century: Oppenheimer, Fermi, Bethe. Security was suffocating. Mail was censored. Travel was restricted. And armed guards patrolled every fence. Yet, walking through those top-secret corridors was a man who didn't look like a threat to anyone. Klaus Fuchs was the kind of person you'd forget the moment he left the room. He was thin, wore thick spectacles, and spoke with a soft, precise German-British accent. His colleagues didn't just respect him, they liked him. He was the kind neighbor of the mesa. He babysat for other scientists, shared his meager rations, and was known for his incredible, almost mechanical work ethic. Hans Bethe, the head of the theoretical division, called him one of the most valuable men on his team. Even Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, trusted him implicitly. But while Fuchs was helping calculate the exact amount of fuel needed to ignite the atmosphere, he was also doing something else. He was looking, he was listening, and he was remembering. Fuchs possessed what colleagues described as a photographic memory. He didn't need miniature cameras or hidden microphones. He could attend a high-level briefing on the implosion lens of the plutonium bomb and, hours later, recreate the complex mathematical formulas and technical blueprints perfectly in his mind. To the world, he was a brilliant refugee contributing to the defeat of tyranny. But behind those thick glasses lay a mind that had already decided the United States could not be trusted with a monopoly on this power. He was a ghost in the machine, a man who shared a carpool with his friends in the morning and plotted the theft of their life's work by moonlight. How does a man live a double life so perfect that even the most paranoid security apparatus in history fails to see him. To find that answer, we have to go back to a childhood forged in a world where secrets were the only way to stay alive. To understand why a man like Klaus Fuchs would hand over the most lethal weapon ever devised to a dictator like Joseph Stalin, we have to look at the wreckage of the world that raised him. 1919. Rüsselsheim, Germany. While the rest of the world is trying to forget the horrors of the Great War, Germany is a boiling cauldron of chaos. This is where young Klaus begins to see the world not in shades of gray, but as a battlefield of absolute truths. His father, Emil Fuchs, was a man who lived at the intersection of two worlds that rarely shook hands: the Lutheran Church and radical socialism. Emil was a Muxu-Kaptian, a man who preached the gospel on Sundays and fought for workers' rights on Mondays. In the Fuchs household, the dinner table wasn't just for eating, it was a seminar on moral duty. Klaus learned early on that if you believe something is right, you don't just talk about it. Ban Fai Han Zhong, no matter the cost. But as the 1920s bled into the 1930s, a new, darker force began to shadow the streets. The Nazis were rising, and they didn't care for the Christian socialism of the Fuchs family. Klaus, now a brilliant student of mathematics and physics, watched as the Weimar Republic, a fragile experiment in democracy, crumbled under the boots of the brown shirts. He saw his father hounded and eventually imprisoned for his beliefs. He saw his mother driven to a tragic, broken end. In this world of fire and iron, Klaus made a choice. He saw the Nazis as an ultimate evil, and in his cold, logical mind, there was only one force disciplined enough, hard enough, and dedicated enough to stop them: the Communist Party. He didn't join for the posters or the rallies. He joined because he believed the communists were the only ones who wouldn't blink in a fight. By 1933, the Gestapo was hunting him. He was a notorious communist in a country where that was a death sentence. Klaus Fuchs had to disappear. He fled across the border into France, then eventually to England, carrying nothing but his brilliance and a secret fire of ideology that would eventually burn the very nations that gave him refuge. He had survived the collapse of one world, but at a terrible price. He had learned that loyalty to a country is nothing compared to loyalty to a cause. Klaus Fuchs arrives in Bristol, England. He is a man with nothing. No money, no status, just a brilliant mind and a suitcase full of secrets. For a few years, it seems he has found a home. He earns his PhD. He works with the finest physicists in the country, and he even applies for British citizenship. He is safe from the Gestapo. But in September 1939, the world changes again. The sirens of World War II begin to wail, and suddenly, the brilliant refugee becomes a dangerous alien. As Winston Churchill warns of a fifth column of spies hiding in the shadows, the police come for Fuchs. He is rounded up with thousands of others and shipped across the Atlantic to an internment camp in Quebec, Canada. Imagine the scene. A man who risked his life to fight fascism, now locked behind barbed wire by the very people he thought were his allies. He is treated with suspicion, forced to live in a cage, while the Nazis he hates are burning London. This is where the mask began to harden. In those cold Canadian barracks, Fuchs didn't see a mistake of war. He saw a betrayal by the capitalist West. The seed of what he later called his controlled schizophrenia was planted here. He began to believe that Britain and America were not the heroes of the story. They were simply the other side of a corrupt coin. But fate has a strange sense of humor. While he was in the camp, a letter arrived from a woman in England named Ursula Kuczynski, better known to Soviet intelligence as Sonia. She was a master spy, a colonel in the Red Army, and she had been watching Fuchs. She knew his history. She knew his anger. By early 1941, Fuchs was released and sent back to England. The British government apologized and asked for his help in a secret project. Fuchs smiled, accepted the invitation, and prepared for his next assignment. He was a refugee again, but this time, he wasn't looking for a home. He was looking for a way to settle the score. In early 1941, the British government was desperate. London was being pounded by the Blitz, and the scientific community had reached a terrifying conclusion. A weapon of unimaginable power, an atomic bomb, was theoretically possible. They called the project Tube Alloys. It was the most closely guarded secret in the history of the British Empire. But they had a problem. They had the vision, but they lacked the raw mathematical firepower to make it a reality. They needed Klaus Fuchs. The British logic was simple. They needed brains more than they feared aliens. Fuchs was recruited by Rudolf Peierls, another German refugee, to work at the University of Birmingham. On his first day, Fuchs was asked to sign the Official Secrets Act, a solemn vow of silence to the king. He took the pen, signed his name with a steady hand, and looked the security officer in the eye. He looked like the perfect, loyal civil servant. But here is the staggering irony that still haunts intelligence historians. MI5 had conducted a background check. They actually found a report from the German Gestapo explicitly stating that Fuchs was a notorious communist. But the British officials looked at the report and shook their heads. They dismissed it. Why? Because it came from the Nazis. They assumed the Gestapo was just trying to smear a brilliant man who had escaped their grasp. In their arrogance, they threw the warning in the trash. While Fuchs was helping the British calculate the critical mass of uranium-235, he was already planning his first delivery. He didn't wait for the Americans to build Los Alamos. He started right there in Birmingham. His first contact was a woman named Ursula Kuczynski, codename Sonia. She lived in a quiet cottage in the English countryside, looking like a typical housewife raising her children. On weekends, Fuchs would take long, innocent walks in the hills. He would meet Sonia, and while they chatted about the weather or their families, he would hand over carbon copies of his latest research on gaseous diffusion. The British were paying him to win the war for the West. Stalin was getting the results for free. Fuchs was no longer just a scientist. He had become a human pipeline, funneling the most dangerous knowledge on Earth to Moscow. And the best was yet to come. In 1943, the British and Americans signed a pact to merge their efforts. Fuchs was told he was going to America. He was going to the heart of the machine. He was going to New York. December 1943. While the steel-gray Atlantic churned with the threat of German U-boats, a troop ship docked in Newport News, Virginia. Among the elite British scientists stepping onto American soil was a man who had already breached their trust long before he arrived. Klaus Fuchs was no longer just a refugee physicist. He was now a prestigious guest of the United States government, a vital gear in the most expensive and secret scientific gamble in human history, the Manhattan Project. His first stop wasn't a desert lab, but the heart of the world's most crowded city. Fuchs was assigned to a team at Columbia University in New York. Imagine the scene. While millions of New Yorkers went about their lives, riding the subways and visiting the theaters of Broadway, Fuchs was sitting in a nondescript office at 270 Broadway, calculating the mathematical impossibilities of separating uranium-235. He was at the very epicenter of the Big Apple, yet he was more invisible than ever. But New York was just the prologue. In August 1944, Fuchs was summoned to the Hill, the top-secret laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico. To the U.S. Army, he was Dr. Klaus Fuchs, a brilliant theoretical mind whose expertise was desperately needed to solve the implosion problem. This was the most difficult part of building the plutonium bomb, the device that would eventually become Fat Man. If the math was off by a fraction of a millimeter, the bomb would fizzle. Fuchs didn't just join the theoretical division, he became its backbone. He worked directly under Hans Bethe and alongside the legendary Richard Feynman. He had access to the safe combinations, the blueprints, and the most sensitive meeting rooms. He knew the size of the plutonium core, the design of the high explosive lenses, and the exact timing of the firing mechanism. The Americans had built a fortress of secrecy, a city behind razor wire designed to keep the world out. But they had made one fatal mistake. They had invited the world's most disciplined spy to live inside the vault. Fuchs now had the crown jewels of American science in his head. The only question left was, how would he get them out? Who was waiting for him in the shadows of the high desert to carry these secrets to the Kremlin? While the American military was obsessively searching for complex codes and high-tech infiltration, the greatest intelligence transfer in history happened over a few quiet, mundane conversations in a dusty New Mexico town. If Los Alamos was the vault, then Santa Fe was the hole in the floor. Klaus Fuchs was one of the few scientists allowed to own a car, a luxury he used to drive the 35 winding miles down from the mesa into the city. There, beneath the high desert sun, he met his new contact, a man he knew only as Raymond. To history, this was Harry Gold, a short, balding, and seemingly harmless courier from Philadelphia who looked more like a grocery clerk than a mastermind of international espionage. The meetings were almost insultingly simple. They would meet at the Castillo Street Bridge or near the local museum. They would walk together, two men blending into the weekend crowds of tourists and locals. While they chatted, Fuchs would slide a thick envelope or a stuffed briefcase to Gold. Inside were the literal keys to the kingdom, hand-drawn sketches of the Fat Man bomb, the precise dimensions of the plutonium core, and the revolutionary mathematical calculations for the high explosive lenses. Fuchs didn't just give data, he gave instructions. He explained the physics to Gold, a man who barely understood the science, so that Gold could pass the importance of the documents up the chain. It was a staggering betrayal. While his colleagues were working 18-hour days, fueled by coffee and the fear of a Nazi bomb, Fuchs was handing their blood, sweat, and genius to a man who would put it in a diplomatic pouch destined for Moscow. The sheer audacity of it is what remains so shocking. The FBI was watching the borders, the mail, and the phone lines, yet they never noticed the quiet scientist and the pudgy courier sharing a moment on a public bridge. By the time they shook hands and parted ways, the Soviet Union didn't just have a spy, they had a mirror. They were seeing everything we were doing, exactly as we were doing it. And as the summer of 1945 approached, the biggest test of all was coming. A test that Stalin would see before the President of the United States even knew it had happened. July 16, 1945, 5:29 a.m. The Jornada del Muerto, the Journey of the Dead, desert in New Mexico. A group of exhausted scientists, soldiers, and officials wait in the pre-dawn darkness. Among them stands Klaus Fuchs. He is wearing welder's goggles, lying face down on the sand, his heart hammering against his ribs. This is the Trinity test, the culmination of 3 years, $2 billion, and the combined genius of the Western world. Then, it happens. A flash of light so blinding it seems to peel back the fabric of the universe. A heat like a furnace door opening. A massive, purple-green fireball roars into the sky, followed by a shockwave that knocks the breath out of the spectators. Hans Bethe turns to Fuchs and shouts over the roar, "It worked!" Fuchs nods silently. He knows more than just that it worked. He knows the math was right. He knows the implosion lenses he helped design have just changed the nature of power forever. But the real drama was happening thousands of miles away in Potsdam, Germany. President Harry Truman had just received a coded cable. babies satisfactorily born. He was at a summit with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin, and he believed he now held the ultimate ace in the hole. On July 24th, Truman walked up to Stalin and, casually, mentioned that the United States had a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Truman watched Stalin's face closely, expecting shock, fear, or at least a flurry of questions. Instead, Stalin didn't even blink. He smiled, puffed on his pipe, and simply said he hoped the Americans would make good use of it against the Japanese. Truman was baffled. Was the Russian leader too dull to understand? Did he think it was just a bigger conventional bomb? Truman didn't realize that Stalin had been reading over his shoulder for years. Thanks to the reports Fuchs had handed to Harry Gold in Santa Fe, Stalin knew about the Trinity test before Truman did. He knew the date, the location, and the expected yield. While Truman was trying to use the bomb as a diplomatic hammer to intimidate the East, Stalin was already ordering his own scientists to move to full speed. Fuchs had not just stolen a secret, he had neutralized a superpower's greatest advantage. As the war ended and the world pivoted from hot battlefields to a cold standoff, Fuchs returned to England as a hero of science. But the net was finally starting to close. A secret project in Washington was about to find a needle in a haystack of coded messages, and that needle had Klaus Fuchs's name written all over it. By 1946, the war was over, but a new, quieter conflict was beginning. Klaus Fuchs returned to England, not as a suspicious alien, but as a prestigious leader of the British nuclear establishment at Harwell. He was the head of the Theoretical Physics Division, a man of immense influence and absolute trust. He had a nice house, a decent salary, and the respect of the entire scientific community. He was the golden boy of British science. But while Fuchs was settling into his comfortable new life, a group of code breakers in an army post in Arlington, Virginia, were pulling on a thread that would unravel his entire world. This was Project Venona. Since the early 1940s, American cryptanalysts had been laboring over a massive backlog of thousands of encrypted Soviet diplomatic cables. For years, these messages were unbreakable walls of numbers. But in 1949, they finally broke through. One specific message from the Soviet consulate in New York, dated 1944, described an agent code-named Rest. The details were specific. He was a theoretical physicist, part of the British mission, and he was working on the atomic bomb. The FBI and MI5 began a process of elimination. One by one, names were crossed off. When the list reached Klaus Fuchs, everything aligned. The background, the timing, the access. But there was a problem. The Venona evidence was so secret that it couldn't be used in a court of law without alerting the Soviets that their codes were broken. They needed a confession. Enter Jim Scarden, MI5's most patient and polite interrogator. Scarden didn't use bright lights or rubber hoses. He used conversation. He met Fuchs for lunches at the Queen's Hotel in Abingdon. He was friendly, almost sympathetic. He spoke to Fuchs about the burden of holding on to secrets and the unburdening of the conscience. It was a psychological masterclass. In January 1950, the mask finally slipped. Fuchs realized the net was too tight. During one of their long, civilized walks, he looked at Scarden and began to talk. He didn't just admit to spying. He unspooled a decade of betrayal, revealing the bridge in Santa Fe, the documents in Birmingham, and the ghost of Los Alamos. The kind neighbor had finally stopped lying. The sun he had stolen for Stalin was about to set on his own freedom. In March 1950, at the Old Bailey in London, the trial of Klaus Fuchs took less than 90 minutes. There was no dramatic defense, no heated cross-examination, only a quiet, guilty plea. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison, the maximum allowed because, at the time of his first leaks, the Soviet Union was technically an ally. He was stripped of his British citizenship, becoming a man without a country, a genius reduced to a number in a cell. When he was released 9 years later for good behavior, he didn't stay to rebuild his life in the West. He boarded a plane for East Germany, where he was greeted not as a traitor, but as a returning hero of the revolution. He spent his final decades as a high-ranking scientific official, receiving the Karl Marx Medal and the Order of Merit. But the world he had left behind was now locked in the very balance of terror he had helped create. Fuchs called his state of mind controlled schizophrenia. He could truly love his friends at Los Alamos, babysit their children, and share their meals, while simultaneously calculating how to hand their life's work to their greatest enemy. He didn't do it for the money. He refused nearly all payment from the KGB. He did it out of an arrogant, lonely conviction that he, and he alone, should decide the fate of humanity. Today, his legacy remains as split as the atom itself. To some, he was a monster who betrayed the people who gave him refuge from the Nazis. To others, he was a visionary who prevented a nuclear monopoly, ensuring that no single superpower could ever use the bomb without the certainty of its own destruction. Klaus Fuchs died in 1988, just a year before the Berlin Wall fell, and the ideology he sacrificed everything for began to crumble. He stole the sun and gave it to the Kremlin, but in the long shadow of the mushroom cloud, we are still left with a haunting question. Was he the man who started the most dangerous arms race in history, or the man who inadvertently saved us from it? Some secrets, it seems, are too heavy for even the greatest minds to carry.